A very good afternoon and welcome to Africa Trade Brief. Our continent is home to 17% of the world's population but accounts for only 4% of global power supply investment. That's according to the International Energy Agency, the Africa Energy Outlook 2019. So the findings of that outlook are very dire. Only half of the population have access to electricity, and the businesses and communities that do have access suffer from bad and costly service, if not regular blackouts. That's familiar to a lot of us, right? So in 2018, as much as 80% of sub-Saharan African companies suffered frequent electricity disruptions, leading to economic losses. Let's take a look at the energy mix on our continent. We see in Nigeria, bioenergy and other renewables make up the majority there. Other West African countries also having strong bioenergy. Oil is quite a big component across the continent. When it comes to South Africa, coal makes up the majority there, and that's what's taking place in terms of the energy mix on our continent. This graphic, though, is from 2012. So I wanted to find out what's a more recent mix and what are some predictions for the future. Let's take a look. The IEA expects Africa to continue to consume a considerable amount of coal and oil-fired power. Looking at projects expected to come online in Zimbabwe, Senegal, Nigeria and Mozambique, that organization projects that coal-fired power will grow from 3 gigawatts today to 17 gigawatts in the higher growth Africa scenario. So most of electricity needs are met through new grid connections, renewable sources making the largest contributions, followed by gas. That's according to their projections of what's going to happen in Africa in our future, taking us from 2018 to 2040. So it's said that around 600 million people in Africa do not have access to electricity. In terms of renewable energy production, that picture varies from country to country. So Zambia and the Democratic Republic of Congo have close to 100% renewable electricity production from hydropower facilities. Ethiopia too, but also has wind power, which now accounts for around 4% of its power generation. Morocco and South Africa are among the African countries investing most in modern wind and solar power facilities. But South Africa still generates less than 3% of its electricity from renewables. And so this is a look at the graphics we were just talking to you about now and where we could possibly going in terms of renewables. Speaking of, renewables targets are falling by the wayside. That's according to an African solar survey. An overview of the state of solar across the continent by that trade body, the Africa Solar Industry Association, has highlighted, and I'm quoting here, a patchy policy landscape where clean power ambitions are often not followed through. Rich solar potential has yet to translate into generation capacity across much of our African continent. So let's speak then to Dr. Tosin Etomi, who is the country manager from Sahara Group. It's an African energy conglomerate. Thanks so much for your time on SABC News this afternoon. So you have to characterize what kind of energy mix Africa has. What would you say it is?
On the continent today is still falls short of where it should be. I mean, based on the numbers that you've just shown, there are just a handful of countries that are making the right direction in terms of having a healthy balance in terms of energy mix fuel sources. For instance, Ghana has hydro at 68%, while 31% accounts for thermal production. And then even Nigeria still has a fair share of fossil fuels, still accounting for the major source of energy. If you go down to Angola and Tanzania, 58% and above accounts for biomass fuel as the major source of their energy. This is why in Sahara Group, we've been here over 25 years. We've seen the trend, and we've seen that there's been more clamor for cleaner sources of energy. I remember in 2014 where I spearheaded the negotiations with the Korean shipyard for construction of LPG ships, because we've seen that the future is cleaner fuels. There still leaves a lot to be done in terms of renewable energy. 40%. Africa, for instance, is able to supply 40% of solar, but currently we're doing a dismal 1% across board. So in terms of the energy mix, there's still a lot to be done to catch up, at least close the gap between us and the rest of the world.
What's the state of intra-Africa energy trade on the continent, and how will the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement impact this?
That's a very interesting question. You would not believe in 2018 and 2019, what the data shows is the volume of trade that was done intra-Africa is 15%, was 15%, I beg pardon, which shows you that 85% was done outside of the continent, with the EU and China the greatest beneficiaries. There's a need for, regional push for more trade to be done across the continent. That's why even in our organization, we've been at the champion of this cause, because we believe that the African Free Continental Trade Agreement is a welcome development, and the responsibility for pushing that should not rest on that of government alone. Corporate society like ourselves should be at the center of this conversation to push the trade. I mean, you can imagine that the GDP of Africa today is around $3.3 trillion US, and then there's the consumer spending power estimated to reach 2.1 trillion by 2025. And the IMF just recently released a report where they say, the population of the continent is going to double in another 20 to 25 years, which shows you that there will be even more spending power. So there's a need for us to begin to encourage intra-African trade. And what does the ACTA do? It brings, all the countries together on the table. It creates a single market. It creates an environment that fosters investments. It makes sure that there's a harmonization and of tariffs, of tax regime. There's a coordinated policy drive across board. It makes doing business easy. And one of the other advantages of the free trade, it begins to open our minds up, because as we trade, we begin to realize things that we need to do to foster, an environment where trade is seamless, movement of goods and services are seamless across the globe. So the current state we're still at the very beginning of this initiative, but it's one where, we need to all rally behind and champion the cause. For us in Sahara, we've been trying to ensure that, African trade is not just responsibility of the government alone. For instance, some years ago, we managed to do what we call a full cycle out transaction, where we, exported crude to the refinery in Ivory Coast, and then we imported from the Ivory Coast refined products. And all across the value chain, we ensured that we used indigenous African service providers, from the logistics to the financing to the inspection companies and all whatnot. We're all indigenous. So yes, it's a welcome development, and it's one that we should all rally behind and push through to ensure that we grow capacity on the continent. And there's no way we can grow capacity if we don't get involved. So all hands should be on deck in this regard.
So there has been a lot of jubilation, and people speaking like you are speaking when it comes to that free trade area agreement that was implemented this year. But then there's also complaints about the many challenges perhaps that there are about doing business, intra-Africa trade on the continent. So I'd just like you to briefly speak to me about that, and then also the opportunities that you believe are there on the continent when it comes to energy and trade.
Listen, the truth is that Africa is blessed with lots of resources. I don't want to sound cliche, but I mean, it's a well-known fact. But in terms of the challenges that we face, because we have presence in over 20 countries across the continent, the peculiarities of each of these countries, but there's something that cuts across board. For instance, it's the deficit in infrastructure, to support the trade that we do. Second of all is the mistrust and the lack of collaboration. There's a need for us to collaborate more, to be able to grow capacity. There's a lot of room. I mean, there's nothing esoteric about, the space that we operate in. So there's a lot of room for to build more capacity within indigenous African organizations like ourselves, to be able to, ensure that we shorten the learning curve and we're able to surmount all of these challenges, because the need for, like you mentioned earlier, there's a huge deficit when it comes to accessing power. There's a need to ensure that, securing constant, consistent, cheaper, cleaner energy is one that we do. And that responsibility, like I said earlier, should also be embraced by all and sundry in this regard. Look, the IMF projects that the population of Africa is going to more than double in another 20 years, like I mentioned. What that does is there will be waste. So what does that tell you? That there will be opportunity for renewables, recycling. There's over $1 trillion opportunity in that regard. So yes, there are challenges, but all hands need to be on deck to ensure that the challenges are surmounted in this regard. We need to collaborate more. That's why, again, to bring the thing home, we partnered with United Nations Development Program to ensure that there's access to cleaner energy. So this responsibility cannot just be ours alone. We need to see more initiatives like this by other indigenous African companies within this space and outside of the space as well.
Dr. Etomi, in a minute or less, what's the future of Africa's energy mix? Where will we be in, say, 2040?
Look, we all know that the transition is here to stay. Everybody needs to embrace that. Where we need to be and where we would be are two different conversations. By 2040, I want to say I'll be optimistic that there will be more push for renewables, but we are currently not seeing policy direction matching with, action. So where we need to be is a state where, lots of renewable energy accounts for a greater percentage in the energy mix. But by 2040, I know that hopefully there will be a lot more renewables in that sector rather than just reliance on fossil fuels. We need to do a lot more to ensure that we are the champions of the renewable energy conversation.
Dr. Tosin Etomi, thanks so much for your time on SABC News. He is the country manager for Sahara Group in Ghana, discussing energy and our future on the continent. With that, let's stay with that. Total's liquefied natural gas project in Mozambique could resume within the next 18 months. That's the word from the African Development Bank's president, Akinwumi Adesina. This follows the deployment of a number of African armies, including Rwandan forces, in the country to help quell an insurgency that took place in the country earlier this year. Total suspended its $20 billion LNG project in Mozambique indefinitely in April this year after an escalation of violence with an attack by Islamic State-linked militants in the Palma region in March, where its facilities are based, proving to be the last straw, raising safety concerns. Adesina believes the intervention of African forces will help stabilize the northern region of Mozambique, adding that he doesn't think the brief interruption will affect the long-term prospects of that LNG project. In the meantime, Total remains mum on the subject. With that, let's take a look at how African markets and currencies are performing.